Okay, thank you for joining us tonight. I hope everybody had a good spring break and is doing well this week. And I do apologize for having to change things up at the last minute as I was driving uh, through Nash County on my way here. I noticed that the battery light on my car was blinking on and off, and I was able to make it back before the battery went out. So I got to take the car to the shop tomorrow. But I thank everybody for their willingness to go along in order for us to have class this evening. Tonight is focused on the text on the book that I had y'all read, The Changing World Order by Ray Dalio. And I hope to have an excellent discussion with y'all on this book. I imagine it was a very interesting book. Some of y'all may have an interest in history books and probably found it very interesting. Some of you, it may have been a little different than what you're used to. What I will say from my perspective is that one of my two undergraduate degrees is in history. It was a subject that I really enjoyed studying in college, and I continue to try to find ways to study it. And in my career in the public sector, I've learned that there is a lot to know about understanding certain dynamics and issues and concepts in terms of how to deal and what to deal with the people that you serve, particularly in local government. A lot of it is dependent upon having an understanding of the history of given localities. This is especially true in areas where the population tends to lean older, particularly the politically active population. The socially active population tends to lean older than perhaps you are. And so it's very important to take the time to really learn about the history of a community, not just the stuff that's talked about in the formal writing, but as much from the standpoint of original sourcing. Like, I've gone back and read, we started here in Rocky Mount doing a kind of a standardized budget document back in the 1960s. It was kind of originally based off of the original budget concepts that were developed for New York City. And I would go through those books just to kind of get an idea of what the budget looked like, how they did budgeting. And then starting in the 70s, we actually started doing budget messages, budget letters that came from the manager to council. And it's very interesting to look at them. And I had a chance to look at, I referenced back to one that was from the mid to late 70s from the manager, and they talked about raising wages about 12% at that time for employees as a cost of living adjustment to counteract inflation. And when you think about what a lot of people are dealing with now and how inflation in some ways may be underreported, the formal numbers on inflation may be underreported. A lot of people are experiencing in their own lives a rate of inflation higher than what's being touted by the federal government and their statistics. It makes you realize that sometimes history does repeat itself. And obviously that's a major theme from this book about the repeating of history in terms of how empires or nation states in this case kind of go through a cycle of growth and decline. So we're going to talk about that. I'm going to give you guys a chance to talk as much as possible when we get into the group discussion about this book, which will be the primary focus for tonight. And then also we'll talk about the assignments for next week. We have finished all the primary reading in the text, and we'll get back next week to talking about the appendices, because there's some good information to look at with respect to the appendices. And I think you'll find some good information there. So I want to go ahead and open the floor up. First of all, what were some general thoughts about the book?
I'll go first. I found the book like somewhat harrowing. You know, it just makes it paints this picture of inevitable decline, which the U.S. is in, as the author says. The end of these sorts of things, as he paints, can be pretty volatile. So it's not like I'm unaware of the circumstances going on around me already, but to put it in the context of a decline that you can't really stop was, like I said, harrowing.
Yeah, and that's kind of, I think, one of the things about this book that I wanted to make sure that people understood is there are, even though Dalio's concept and premise is that it's not necessarily, you're not able to necessarily stop decline, as Jack referenced, there are, and that it doesn't necessarily mean, for example, says in this book, and he has been going out pretty regularly when he's talked on TV and on podcasts and such, really talked about, hey, the US is in a state of decline. And what he's not saying is that this means the end to the United States. That's important to understand. He's not saying that the United States is going to end. He sees us becoming, in a lot of ways, like other empires have, particularly like the British, in that prior to the world wars, as he talked about, the British economy was the central economy of the world, and that all changed. It became us during the course of the early 20th century. And it's entirely possible that another power will come along and assume the place of being the central economy. And when that happens, the US will remain, but it'll remain in a smaller role, which will pose its own challenges. What are some other people's thoughts?
I can go next. I really enjoyed the fact that he was able to reference the pandemic. I feel like in a lot of textbooks or just books that we read for classes, you're kind of stuck with this, like, oh, but what would they say if they had known a pandemic was coming? And so it was kind of, not that he talked a whole lot about it, but the little parts where he was able to bring it in, I really appreciated.
Right. And there's still a lot of challenges with respect to the pandemic, because there's kind of a lag that comes to the writing of history. History has a tendency to take some time to properly record, and even in the case of data analysis, we're finally now getting to a point where medical journals and such are actually reviewing the data from the pandemic. We had real-time analysis, but there's oftentimes error in real-time analysis, like what the CDC had to report last week with respect to child deaths. They had over-reported child deaths due to some faults in their system. And so they went back and had to revise it downward, which is good news overall with respect to the fact that it meant that it was less harmful to children than we thought. And we overall thought it was not very harmful to children anyway. To go to Bree, she says, yes, I agree. It was a very eye-opening book. I thought the way he explained it in a way that was easier to understand, which I appreciated, because other books have been a lot more difficult. Would agree with that. It's a bit of a grim concept, but I think he outlined the issues well and also described some hopes for the future. And also important to understand his background. He, of course, talks about that he's been heavily involved in the investment industry most of his career. So he kind of looks at it from a financial perspective, and that's great because that kind of ties into the work that we're doing in this class, even though we look at political economy, not necessarily from a pure financial sense. I think it does resonate with a lot of what we have talked about in this course. Shannon?
Oh, I was gonna add kind of off of like what Jack was saying, how you can really see like where America is like within the stages, especially like stage 5, which talks a lot about like misinformation and like the rise of like populism and like really strict like sides, like political sides, and like socioeconomic kind of like struggle between like the rich and the poor, and like that's been increasing more and more in America. So it's kind of wild to see where we specifically are within the cycles that he talks about.
Okay. Tira?
Yeah, I was just going to echo what I think it was Jacob. I'm sorry. Jack, sorry,
Yeah.
Jack. I was just going to echo what Jack and Shannon just said. It's very cool and interesting. I know Shannon and Jessica and I were chatting about this yesterday. How much you can see like those cycles throughout history, and just having all the patterns laid out in front of you is very interesting. And it's very it was a fun read because you can see those cycles being played out in the historic stories that we already know.
Absolutely. Branson?
Hey, so one point that I thought was very interesting that he made was like, because that we're only living 70, maybe 80 years, it's the mindset that we're in, then most of these things will happen once during a lifetime. So like we're gonna have one global pandemic, and I mean, well, who knows? Or we're gonna have one Great Depression like incident, or one humongous war, right? But I mean, just like the mentality, because we're not always thinking on a macro scale. Like, I mean, he zoomed way out, where 100 years was like a storyline. And so, I mean, how often are we thinking in 100, 500 year increments? We're just more focused on like the here and now and the problems that are in front of us. And so I just enjoy the fact that, I mean, perspective is a great thing.
Absolutely. Carl?
Well, I enjoyed reading the book and I thought it was interesting. There were two things that, in my opinion, make me not super bullish on his argument. The first is that he was looking at the countries, well, he's looking at all countries. The cycle applies to all countries, but specifically the leading country and its reserve currency, which there's only a sample size of 2 that have completed that, the Netherlands and the United Kingdom. So we don't know for sure with that sample size if it applies to all countries with the reserve currency. And second is, I understand why he did it and he had to do it, but he had to leave out a lot of history that could be important for understanding the cycle in countries. So leaving out that data makes me not as bullish on it as I might be, but he's obviously made a lot of money off of these bets. He has $22 billion. So
Yeah.
there's a good chance he's right.
Okay. Drew?
And sorry, I can't turn my camera on with where I am right now.
That's okay.
But you can look at my lovely headshot, which probably looks better than I do at the end of the business day. But with that being said, I actually thought stylistically he did a great job presenting his argument, because it feels like really frequently we hear these narratives about these leading countries, and a lot of it feels very slanted. And I thought he did a great job presenting this data and this information in a way where it wasn't biased towards a country or a particular issue. It just felt like it was very well researched and presented in a way where it was just a very objective, not so much subjective take on the matter. So I thought that was a little bit refreshing for me.
Absolutely. Jessica?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention one of the things that I find interesting, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about it, is just when he mentions how you operate wealth and power, how that comes a lot from education and inventiveness. And I'm just trying to like understand, I feel like the US, for those to be some of the, you said education, innovation, technology, like I feel like, yeah, the US works towards making sure that we're developing technology, but I don't foresee like them prioritizing education. I feel like, and just how that leads to, these wealth and social gaps. I don't know. I guess that was like one of the more frustrating parts, seeing that you mentioned that. Sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead and finish.
Yeah, I was just, the fact that he mentioned how important these things were. And I feel like if we know that these things are so important, I'm just wondering why or how we can improve as a country.
Those are some excellent points. What I think would be helpful for us right now, and I think, Jessica, we can definitely get back to that, So I'll make a note. I need to make a mental note of that. But first of all, what I want to do is I want to spend just a second looking at the cycle, at the big cycle. And I took this off from a website, and this is kind of the cycle. This is what Dalio kind of provides generally in the text. And from the reading, where are we at this point? Where does he kind of say that we are at this point on the cycle? Morgan?
Yeah, so what I understood from the reading was that he kind of puts us right after the peak, sort of maybe between the debt bust and the printing money, somewhere like right in there. We're definitely not on the revolution and war spectrum yet, but we're not too far away from that either.
Okay, Holly, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, and I don't know why it says habitat on there. I can't change my name
That's
from previously.
okay. That's okay.
But yeah, I was just gonna say what Robert just put in the chat. I remember Dalio saying we're at about 70% through the cycle. So yeah, right kind of where your cursor is, but
Yeah.
not quite all the way to the revolution and full restructuring.
So where does he feel like we reached? So let's take a timeline back. When did this new world order come about? When did this happen? When did we get here? When did we start?
Post World War II.
Right. So I think he talks a bit about Bretton Woods, when basically by the end of the Second World War, most of the wealth of the world was here in the United States. And why was that?
Because we got off best after World War II and lent like Europe a bunch of money, and we didn't have much to repair. And so sure, we had a little bit of like a depression, a little bit of extra like unemployment, but that's because of all the people who were in the military who now
Right.
no longer have a job. But so we got off the best after World War II.
Yeah, there was expectations of a shock, but after the end of the war, continental Europe was severely decimated, obviously so. And whatever money they had either been committed or given to the US to pay for what the costs of the war were. You have to remember that the US as a war manufacturer was not just producing armament for the US military effort, we were also producing it for the entire Allied power, for all of the Allied powers, the British, the French, all of them. I mean, basically, while there was a lot of sharing of personnel, the U.S. was the industrial backbone for the entire war effort, and it created a situation where the U.S. had to kind of take this leadership role. Prior to this, of course, the U.S. had always, even in its response in the First World War, had kind of been seen as an isolationist state. It understood to some degree that it had to have a war. It had to have relationships with other countries. That it had to maintain diplomacy, and of course, there was the fact that through the Monroe Doctrine established in the 19th century under President Monroe, it felt like it was the leader of the Western Hemisphere of the Americas. But beyond that, it really did not see itself as being a party until the Second World War came along, to being a party of power on the global stage in terms of really trying to influence the world. And it led to a lot of the changes that we saw in the post-World War II period. The rise of these formal international alliances that started off with the UN and NATO, then of course evolved into this idea of nation building or protecting other nations from the spread of communism, which led to our efforts in Korea and Vietnam and elsewhere around the world. And of course, in your lifetime, the role that we've played in this global war, this entitled Global War on Terrorism, which is primarily focused on Southern Africa and also South Central Africa and the Middle East. So we've kind of taken on this role, and there was, of course, there was period, as you can see, if you think about the history of America, and if you look at it from an economic perspective, if you look at it from a government balance sheet perspective, if you look at it from a variety, it kind of starts making sense where we are now, in the fact that if you look at, if you were to look at the vital signs of us as a large imposing nation state, the vital signs don't look all that good. And it gets to some challenges that we're seeing to this day. One of the things that could potentially be a factor, and to kind of get to some of the things that have come up, the question is, first of all, is what could possibly happen with respect to our status as a reserve currency? Has anybody been following what's going on right now with Russian currency and China? And wants to say anything and wants to mention anything about that?
I know Russia was cut off from SWIFT, and that a lot of Russian oligarchs are moving their money out of Russia in dollars because they are cut off from SWIFT. And
okay.
then, yeah.
So what's also going on is this: there is this other player that's not talked about all that much, and that's China. So the reality is that China's always had a tendency, and it talks about with some of their past empires. China has always had a much longer term view of its horizon of time than the Americans have ever had. The challenge America has, and other countries have this too, is that America has to look at it from the perspective of being a representative democracy. When you have short tenures of office, like 4 years for president, 6 years for Senate, 2 years for Congress, that tends, of course, and we've talked about this in our discussions, that tends to lend to a shorter term vision of what the future looks like. I mean, when you think about perhaps the longest term vision ever shared by a president publicly was Kennedy, when he talked about reaching the moon. He said this in 1961 about reaching the moon by the end of the 1960s. I mean, that's a pretty, in the grand scheme of history, that's still a pretty short time frame, but he realized it was something that would happen after the end of both of his terms. If he had served a second term, of course, which he didn't because he was assassinated. We tend not to, from a political perspective, really look at long-term thinking. And of course, it's because it's a challenge from a political perspective, given the way our system works. Meanwhile, other powers that are out there, particularly the powers that are talked about, have much different types of government, particularly those that are more theocratic or autocratic, where they have rulers who are in place this for long periods of time and maybe part of family dynasties that can last for centuries. And so it tends to lean more naturally towards a longer range train of thought. So the challenge becomes, and it talks about, so that's a challenge in itself. Well, the Chinese are sitting on this, are for the most part sitting on the sidelines with respect to what's going on between Russia and Ukraine and how the West is intervening. And it's very easy to look at what their government's doing. And I want to be very careful here. I'm talking about the Chinese government leaders and political leaders. I'm not talking about China as a nation of people. I'm talking about their government political leaders and what their thoughts are. China would love to be in a position, because really they're the only other country that could at this point, would really love to be in a position for their currency, the yuan, to establish itself as a reserve currency, to have to be stable and to be considered a globally transacted currency similar to that of the US dollar. this might lead an opening, because what the United States and the rest of the Western world have done is they've basically cut off the Russian government from being able to convert their rubles into dollars. You probably saw last week about how the Russian government was trying to make debt payments on it, make interest payments on its debt, and was not being allowed to, and was technically in default, even though they said, look, we've got the money, it just wasn't being accepted because they had the money in rubles. They were not being given access to their dollars, which were being held overseas. And as such, they weren't in a position to be able to make the payments. That is a situation where they're looking at it and going, what do we do? And it kind of creates a vacuum. Power never likes a vacuum. There's something that always comes along. And so the question we have to ask ourselves is, what does this mean? Now that you have a large nation that does have a tradable asset, and that's oil, it also has some other mineral assets. What does it do? Well, it's going to look for another way. It's not simply going to just say, well, heck with it. So what they're now doing is they're trying to figure out what their next move is. And there's the possibility that they will look to China. They already have, but prior to this happening, going back, and this happened during the Olympics, the Chinese and the Russians signed a pact that included some economic components of it. The Chinese haven't really acted on it yet because they realize that there's going to be repercussions if they choose to align with Russia. But the Chinese government has the potential to do something. And the Russians are right now trying to bring other nations to the table. They've started talking more with India, with the government in India. They're looking at countries in South America, again, nations that are either oil rich or that consume a lot of oil, and are looking at options to possibly be able to create a sphere of influence, enough critical mass to where it's possible that could move fiduciary activity away from the US dollar and towards the Chinese yuan. Now, that could still not happen. It may not be enough enough to make it happen, but it is something that we have to be concerned about. And again, I think this is why obviously our leaders in Washington, our key leaders in Washington, I believe are aware of this. I hope they are. But it is something that we have to keep in the back of our mind, because as important as it is for one empire to decline, it's also important for another empire to rise. Because again, power hates a vacuum. There has to be somebody that assumes the power. It has to be a strong enough entity to be able to do that. And so these are challenges that we're looking at, that if you and the problem is that this kind of discussion is still kind of in a stage where it's really hard to digest. It's really hard to put all the pieces together and really be able to understand it. Because if you were to say it in the simple soundbite terms, it would sound like all hell's about to break loose. And that's not necessarily the case. But it is something that has to be kept in mind. We also, as you can see, based on the step next with printing money and credit, why is it that the money and credit phase, which is where we could be, which is where we have been with COVID, and where we could continuously be, even though interest rates are going up and the Fed's starting to tighten in, how does that end up leading to the revolution and war phase?
Because the dollars are not spread out equally or equitably, and it furthers income inequality and, you know, everything that goes along with that, social tensions, so on.
Absolutely. And what they're primarily talking about here is internal revolution, but it can also come from external sources as well. And we see that we've seen that to some degree. You know, these are where, again, you're talking about how certain policies lead to negative externalities that have to be addressed. So what I'd like to know now is going to the case studies. Did anybody do the Dutch Empire? I haven't had a chance to read the
I
book. So
did.
okay, Carl, what did you get from it?
Just about their cycle.
Yeah, just tell me some of the characteristics.
Well, they had the typical early struggle, but they got out of that because of strong leadership and coupled with a culture focused on innovation, work, monetary, that kind of stuff. They were able to develop the first capitalistic financial institutions, which helped to fund further innovation and got them to the top because of largely their trading empire that they funded with their innovations. However, they got into the period of decadence that Dalio describes, and they slowly were not able to fund their empire, maintain the military. And so there came a point where it all just crashed at once when the East India Company, which was more or less their big money maker, was completely
Right.
crippled. So the Dutch government had to save it, like how Dalio describes how the US did during 2008. But that more or less crippled them financially because they weren't able to support their currency reserves anymore because they devalued their currency so much to bail out the East India Company. And more or less that just led to their collapse.
And then they were replaced, of course, primarily by the British. Anybody have anything else they'd like to add on the Dutch? Yes, Alex.
Yeah, so one of the things that I found, and also, forgive me, I can't put my camera on, and if my
That's
audio
okay.
cuts out, I apologize because the weather has wrecked my internet. But so one of the things that I found most interesting was like this was the first time that a global power kind of was ruled over like different sovereign states and statesmen. And that was something that Dalio mentioned. And I thought that was like an important thing, especially after the fall of the Habsburg Empire, where you had one sovereign leader who was in charge of so much. And you just had that one person kind of making decisions and then eventually splitting off. And then it fell to their decline. That now you have the Dutch Empire taking over, and it's more of a essentially more democratic-ish sort of take on things.
Yeah.
Led to a more prosperous empire.
You maybe not as much democratic as it was federal.
Right.
Another way of looking at it. That's an important. And again, they were the first. They kind of developed this modern concept of colonization. And of course, mainly used it for commercial reasons. Of course, it came with a lot of some severe negative consequences, particularly for those that were encaptured by the colonization, by the rise of colonization. Did anybody else focus on the Dutch for their paper? Okay, not a surprise. It was. Did anybody? I'm trying to remember. Did I? So anybody do? Let's focus on the British. Karen?
I'll fess up. I chose the British because they were actually, I've been watching The Crown and they were talking about the devaluation of the pound in my recent watching. But I felt the British Empire, it was fascinating. And the reason what really stood out, and I actually read from the book, at its peak with only 2.5% of the world's population in the UK, the British Empire produced over 20% of the world's income and controlled over 20% of the world's landmass and over 25% of the global population. And therefore, it became the greatest empire ever, at least at that point in time. And I don't think we'll see it again. So I think that just really stood out.
Absolutely. Leo?
Yeah, I kind of agree with everything like Karen said. I think what I found interesting was how large the wealth gap was. I think it was something around like 75% wasn't just this very small percentage.
Mhm.
And just like I chose the British Empire because I just didn't want to do the US because I thought the US was just like it's already part of the current climate. So I was like, I'll make it a little bit more challenging. Um, to the British Empire, just like how they felt, I thought it was interesting how instead of like continuing to do the norm at the time, they just decided to go into trade and kind of expand on that. I thought it was an interesting way to stabilize their big cycle almost. But then, one thing led to another and they got a lot of debt and they ended up declining and the US rose to power. But that's what I found interesting.
Yeah, I mean, we have to realize, and it's especially the case here in the Americas, that it's really that we still much of the American continents, both North and South America, even though obviously there were multiple European countries that colonized these continents, much of the legacy that we deal with, the positive and the negative, is due to the role the British played. And the British did adjust the model to a certain extent compared to what the Dutch had, and did try to did facilitate it. They did bring in the concept of representative democracy with how they established their colonial systems in some places. Of course, in our case, we weren't happy with the controls on it, but they were able to kind of foster a rather long arc of international dominance that was, of course, eventually brought down by the fact that they were, of course, were the primary focus of the Second World War. I mean, we have to remember that not only was the British, much like us, we're not only fighting, we're fighting a two-front war, because it was not only affecting their presence in Europe, but also affecting their presence throughout the Americas and also in Asia. Anybody else do the British?
Yeah, I did the British, and I was struck by the strength of their strategy at the outset of taking on the New World Order. The book kind of laid out how not only did they do the things that a rising nation does, which is focus on education and infrastructure and invest in all the things internally, but they're also really savvy, taking down the Dutch, and then they timed it perfectly with the first industrial revolution. And that, I mean, he paints a really good picture of why it was such a long and successful empire, because that start was just everything aligned so well. And then it almost was like they hit that point of complacency just before the second industrial revolution, which he makes a point to, which was a contributor to their eventual downfall.
Excellent. Anybody else? Okay, so let's talk about us and about the Americans. Who wants to go first? Nobody did America? Okay, Lydia.
Yes, I did the United States, and I was really struck by our present moment and where we are, and we kind of talked about that at the beginning of class. But I was really struck by this state of internal disorder that we kind of seem to be in right now. And he actually lists 3 things that would push us from stage 5 into stage 6. 1 being the rules being disregarded, 2 being both sides emotionally attacking each other, and 3 blood being spilled. And it almost seems like, I mean, I can definitely find examples of the rules being disregarded, even by our elected officials, and definitely emotional attacks from both political sides. And
I think there's an argument to be made for blood being spilled as well. So that was striking.
It is, and it's a situation where we are right now, we have seen before in our history in this cycle. We saw it predominantly we saw it in the late 60s, but also we saw it in the 70s, in the early 70s. And so the question is, does it elevate beyond this? Does it elevate beyond what we see now? You're absolutely right. Blood is being spilled. The question is, when does it reach that point where it could facilitate going to the next step? And that's not to reduce the impact it has now. It's only simply to say that when does it get to a point where we see what I would say regional, what some people would look at would be, mostly when we talk about blood being spilled, a lot of times it doesn't get to the level that is often associated with insurrection. Some people, of course, think that January 6th was an event of insurrection, and I'm not here to debate that. But the idea of a prolonged insurrection, there are some parts of the country that could say, well, we've seen that in the way some things happened. For example, the autonomous zones in Seattle or something like that. But again, that was still that was relatively peaceful in terms of how everything went. There was some casualty, but it was still generally thought of as a peaceful situation. And riots themselves at a localized level are very devastating. The question becomes, when does that inertia or that energy that you see in a localized riot get to a point of becoming almost like a national revolution? Jessica?
Yeah, I did the US too, and I did the chapter on the value of the dollar. And just connecting it back, like in my assignment, I included an article that I found, and it said that the US is spending more than any other country, including Japan. And just what I focused on was the money printing and how that's causing inflation. And then some of, a lot of people who are more educated and who are aware of this and where they're putting their money, like there's, I think they call it like cryptocurrencies. And so that was something that I found interesting. I was like, man, am I supposed to be doing something like this? Because like it just focused talking about how since the pandemic started, it's been like the most expensive cost that they've had. So I think that what I focused on was really on just how money printing is causing the value of the dollar to decrease.
It is, and we're definitely seeing the impact of that right now with what's going on with inflation. And again, I think I've talked about this before. The government does change measures of inflation from time to time and other measures as well. And they made some changes in the early 80s with respect to inflation specifically. And those had to do a lot with property, with housing, I should say housing, not property, housing. And as a result, if you actually were to use the scaling of inflation the same way it was done in 1982 prior to this change, the inflation rate would be over 12%. Right now, the year over year change would be over 12%. Of course, even with the measures that they show, for some people, the inflation rate may be 7%, but for other people, particularly those who are wage workers, who are hourly wage workers, the inflation rate for them actually is about 9% here in the southeastern United States, and those are the government numbers. So, and a lot of that's been driven by that, the way that we chose to respond to this pandemic in order to facilitate a shutdown of the economy due to that we thought was the best way to mitigate the spread of COVID, put a lot of money out into the economy. And that you have too much money going for too few goods, and that naturally leads to inflation. Holly?
I also did the chapter on the US, and I just found it interesting while reading, thinking, a lot of the periods of time were obviously familiar from previous history classes, like the post-industrial revolution, Gilded Age, all of that. But it was interesting to read about in the context of this big cycle and kind of see how all of those periods led to and interacted with each other and still impact us now. And with the issues of inflation always kind of being at play, but then especially really topical right now, was just interesting. And then I was thinking about how much history has repeated itself, but then also as we emerge into the, I guess, era that we're in now, there are new factors at play, specifically around the cryptocurrency, like what Jessica said, but then also just new technological innovation generally, like through social media and everything. So if and when we get to the point of revolution and civil unrest to that extreme scale, people have more tools to communicate with each other and find information on the COVID pandemic, and then also misinformation on these types of things. So it's kind of interesting looking to the future, how new technology will impact that process.
So I was going to wait on this, but I think I'll go ahead and bring it back up to Jessica in our talk about technology and innovation. When we think about, what are some examples of technological development that we've seen in the last, say, 20 years? So for y'all, everybody here, think about what has been the major technological innovations that we've seen in the last 20 years.
iPhones.
Okay, smartphone. Yep. The internet. Alex?
Global instant communication in general.
Okay. So everything's kind of close to the same theme. Anything else? Electric cars. Branson?
Medical technology, question mark? Because
Okay, there's been some medical technology. GIS, hydrogen fuels, if we would ever get around to actually using them. Anything else in particular? Crypto. So we're definitely seeing military technology, always a big one. Monitoring systems, GIS. So these all deal with technology. 3D printing with concrete, that's definitely one. We're seeing a lot of advancement, and at the same time, the question really is, how are we changing life itself? Medical definitely is an area where we've been able to make some pretty significant changes over time in recent years. We've been able to extend life expectancies, even though they've gone down here in more recent years. We've made some pretty significant discoveries in medicine, but we still have not gone to that step that everybody, that goal line that a lot of people talk about, really, in terms of finding cures or being able to really make these monumental advancements, like with artificial organs and those type of things. And then when we talk about technology, Tyra is absolutely correct. We are more connected than ever, but it breeds misinformation and fuels division. We've been able to, the real questions we have to ask ourselves, when you look at the technological advancements in prior times of our rise, we're talking about considerable advances in previous decades. We're talking about the rise of jet airplanes, the use of the jet engine, which dramatically, not only dramatically reduced travel time, but also made flying safer. The development of space technology, the early medical advancements, like the development of the concept of developing vaccines to begin with, and also being able to have some types of artificial, or the idea of being able to transplant human organs from one person to another. we've been able to make some significant changes. And I would say there is the possibility that making electric a primary energy source in transportation, where currently it's fossil fuel, has potential for that. I'm not saying it doesn't. And at the same time, we kind of have to ask ourselves, what have we really done from a technological standpoint that has that kind of game-changing impact that you can look at previous developments, whether they be in agriculture or transportation or industry or whatever the case may be, that really transform society? And this gets to the discussion about education and technology itself, because there's a lot of, we're kind of at a point right now, and it kind of gets back to that economic concept of the production possibilities curve, that because we're kind of going in the same direction, we're kind of on the same curve. And I would say this curve was bumped up to a significant degree in the 90s by the development of the internet and the whole concept of globalization, which took place in the mid to late 1990s and kind of continued continued since. We're kind of on this same trajectory, and the yield is beginning to flatten. And that means that we're putting in a lot of work. There's, of course, a lot of research going on at NC State. There's research going on over the Triangle and across the country and around the world. But that effort, the increment of advancement that it's achieving, gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And the real question becomes, when do we have that next big shift? When is that shifting event that pushes the curve back out? And I think that's really a challenge. I mean, there are a lot of processes, there's a lot of technology that we use in our daily lives that haven't changed in a very long period of time. You look at the treatment of water. You look at a lot of other things that have gone on. We still use techniques that were modernized in the last 100 years or so, but still derive primarily from what was used during previous civilizations. Some of that's understandable, but some of it also is, how can we do better? So that, I think, and it gets back to education, because Jessica, what would you say is the problem with our education system here? And you don't have to be the only one to answer that, but what do you think is the problem?
I mean, one of the big issues I see is just the inequities, access to education, who has what kind of access, and depending on that access, it develops those wealth gaps, and then those wealth, just that trajectory of, with one problem, it leads to another.
Absolutely. Anybody else would like to add anything?
Yeah, I would say that the infrastructure of our education system overall is just so old and outdated that we're not staying on the cutting edge of the different educational systems that are used all across the globe. And so we're falling behind in the education system in the global stage, and we refuse to we keep trying to add on new things No Child Left Behind, Common Core, et cetera, onto an infrastructure that's so old and outdated that these new things aren't necessarily working to keep us ahead like we should be.
Okay, Morgan.
Something that I thought was interesting in the book, he specifically noted that there was a time in Chinese history when they were doing a lot of research and they kept doing things in the education field, and then it slowly turned into sort of just being more pedantic and doing research for research's sake, which is kind of the trajectory that I see higher academia heading towards. Personally,
we publish a lot of articles. We publish a lot of articles, particularly in public administration. And it's, I mean, that's an excellent point. Anybody else? Okay, Jessica, insecurities in our education system have also been more obvious during the pandemic, but they've always been there. Absolutely. What the pandemic did was expose where a lot of the inequities and inefficiencies are. First of all, it showed the disconnect. First of all, we can talk about the disconnect by economic class or in terms of access to resources like broadband. What we can also say is the disconnect that exists in the system between the family and the school system. And I think, and so we're now starting to, we see this some from a political perspective, but the real question to me has been how much, and to some cases is how much can parents help their children with their education that they're getting in school, but also how much are they choosing? It's a both and. Obviously that there are many families out there that don't have the resources, and that's and there has to be a way to address that. There's also, I think, a tendency for families to be kind of passive in their child's educational development, and some of that could be due to how life has changed for a lot of us. It's not to say that there's necessarily one exact perfect answer. That's not the case either, because we know that there's a lot of people who are able to overcome obstacles in life and are able to achieve great things. So to get back to the technology, and the reason why I think the inequity is important to understand is that so much of true technological transformation is facilitated by the common value of necessity. As they say, necessity is the mother of invention. And what that means is that you have to provide as many people as possible, as broad of a spectrum of the population as possible with the resources to acquire a good education, because it is likely going to be that you're going to get your more revolutionary ideas from the exposure that a lot of people have to the challenges of living at the margins, of living in more challenging environments. And there's a lot of examples that we see of people, not just here, but around the world, who come up with innovative solutions to common problems. And honestly, they're working with very limited resources when they do. And if you can expose them to more resources or more knowledge, particularly, you have the opportunity to achieve more things. I would say that there's there's a lot of different factors involved, and it's certainly, I appreciate what everyone has said here. So let's see. Let's go to China. Who did China?
I did China.
Okay.
Something that I found particularly interesting was just like the two different mindsets. So for the United States, he described us as very individualistic and more willing to like put our own opinions forward, versus like a neo-Confucius view in China is more society and more family oriented, and it's around the role.
Can you pause for a second? I'll be right back. I'm
Okay.
sorry, I need to go for a second. I'll be right back.
You're fine. Yeah. Well, so on another note, has anybody been watching our women's team kick ass in March Madness?
I do not sport.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I tried. Like, our men's team is kind of garbage, but our women's team has been kicking butt. And look, if I'm gonna watch some NC State sports, I'd rather watch the winners. So if you want to watch them beat on somebody by 25 plus points in the national tournament for nothing other than to watch us win, it's a good time.
They're fantastic.
Yeah, it's kind of like the women's national soccer team, also a hell of a lot better than our men's team. And look, if I'm gonna watch sports, I'm gonna watch winners.
Burn, Branson.
Okay, sorry, Branson, go ahead, and then just Shannon after you.
Okay, yeah. So now my big thing was I was just a little bit more interested in about how the whole like Chinese Neo-Confucianist mindset, like like they have what 9 or 10 centuries worth of history versus the United States has only been around for the last 250. So it's that whole idea. I mean, where we don't well, the United States' culture is more of we think more in the present and about ourselves versus learning about the past. And so that this whole like Chinese just their focus is more on like scholarship and learning from the past and research just to just to like do school stuff, I guess.
Right.
And I mean, I thought that was interesting. I mean, now that he mentions it, it makes a lot of sense. But I mean, so much of what my preconceived notion about China was just like, I mean, obviously kind of biased. It's like the news and like textbooks and stuff.
Okay. Shannon?
Yeah, going off a very similar thought process is like China does have their 100-year plan that they're currently using right now in terms of like economic expansion, which really plays out the fact that they're in stage 3, which is like peace and expansion. I thought his overall analysis was maybe too nice. There are a lot of things to be critical about, especially in terms of like China's current economic expansion. But I understand he's a finance guy that does business in China, and especially with state-controlled media and like capital movement, he probably doesn't have a lot of room to actually be critical. And I guess what I wish he had talked about more was as China does have, as they are becoming like a more like rich country with both political and economic influence, but they have state-controlled capital movement. So like this transition into becoming a reserve currency, like will that ever be like possible? And I think like I wish he had talked about how that might impact their status as becoming like a top like hegemon in like the international system.
Excellent points. And I mean, we have to understand that that China has never truly had what you would think of as representative, as true representative rule. Even nationalist China, which of course then became Taiwan, was not, during its time in China, was not a representative regime. It was still a centralized regime in a lot of ways. And then of course China then decided to adopt communism. The Chinese definitely see things in a much different perspective than we do here in the United States and throughout most of the West, and it definitely has a major impact on one, our ability to understand, because we kind of have to adapt to that. We have to lend ourselves to that way of thinking, and then also at the same time start trying to figure out how what we do and how it matches up. And an excellent point, Shannon, about the fact that I could sit there and say that right now China is kind of moving into the debt bubble and big wealth gap phase already, because they have some significant debt issues in their country. You've all probably heard stories about the ghost cities that exist in China. These are residential, commercial, industrial developments in cities that have just kind of been built out of nowhere, where they've just kind of built these cities that nobody lives in. There is a real estate bubble in China at this point. There are some challenges that they have, and so that could potentially be an impediment to them being able to be at that stage of being able to really then kind of redirect to kind of becoming a leader of a new world order. Never liked that phrase, new world order. It kind of makes you feel a little scary inside, particularly if you're someone who believes in individual freedom. But and then obviously China and their broad approach to human rights, or their lack thereof on the part of many segments of their population, is very disturbing. And of course creates a lot of challenges. Of course, we know that the other examples that we shared as well the other examples we looked at also had significant deficiencies with respect to their practices of human rights. Anybody else do China? Okay, so to wrap up our discussion, I want to focus on what is it that what was the biggest takeaway for you from this book? What was like the thing that you look at this book and say, I could really use this? Someone give me an example. Someone who hasn't gone yet.
So sorry, I have really bad allergies right now. But
Okay.
so I also did China, and I think I also thought it was like a little bit too nice to China. There was like a lot of things that I felt like wasn't really mentioned. It was just talking about like, this is how the economy is doing right now.
Yeah.
But I did think like planning for 100 years, I think America could do a lot more long-term planning. And I did think that was interesting. I don't necessarily think we should do it the way China does it, but just like thinking about future, especially in like environmental and public health type of policies.
And you do see some degree of long-term planning at the local level that is more integrated between government and the private society. You will see vision plans, 25, 30-year vision plans that deal maybe not as much overall with respect to the community as a whole, but deal with things with economic development and those type of things. But you're right, you don't really see that at the national level here in the United States. Catherine.
I was just going to say something along the same lines. I also did it China, and the biggest thing for me was just how long their history was, and how the United States can take something away from that, even if they have to adapt it to their own situation. And the same could be said on the local level. Even if your municipality doesn't have the same history, there are municipalities out there that have a longer history, and there are lessons to take from them as well.
Absolutely. Anybody else? Robert. Okay, Christopher? I know the weather may be,
Yeah.
okay, go ahead, Christopher.
So I did mine on the United States, and I definitely, a lot of what I contributed it to is the gaps and how we've gone back and forth with those. But that United States has a lot of foreign challenges as well right now. And I was even able to tie the Ukrainian situation in there with how Russia could possibly do that, use that situation to come back and take power on a world stage that the United States has now.
Okay. Excellent. Okay. Anybody else have any other final thoughts they would like to add? Okay. Well, I'm sorry, go ahead, Morgan.
I was actually just going to add, I think one of the things that I got out of this book was that I need to do more considering of these larger world events when I think about my own personal finances as well. Which like you kind of know, but until someone tells you, it's not something that really is explicit, I guess.
Absolutely. That's important to think about as we all move forward. And I will add this with respect to some concerns about how perhaps Dalio and others, there is a tendency when people, when like popular authors write about China to write about it, not necessarily in as critical of a view. I'm blanking on his name. He's a writer for the New York Times. He's the one who wrote, y'all maybe have read it, The World is Flat. And he's written many times about, when he writes stuff about China, it kind of comes off as a little too sanitized. There is a tendency, right, Friedman, exactly, thank you. I was confusing him with Krugman. But Thomas Friedman at the New York Times writes a lot about, things that he's seen when he's gone to China, and they come off as a little too, hey, China's great. And that's not to say that there aren't major accomplishments being made, but there are certainly some things that even as we try to learn from other nations, we still have to be aware of what the realities are in those places. That can be said as much here as it can be said anywhere else. And it's also something we have to keep in mind with other places as well. I want to thank everybody for their focus, and I look forward to reading the papers. Let's talk about our next assignment, which our next class will be next Thursday, March 31st. And your course text reading is Appendix A from the textbook. And then also, you also will need to work on podcast assignment 3. I will send a link to the assignment tomorrow morning. It'll be in Google Forms again. And then the responses, I have extended the deadline a day. The response deadline will be 6 p.m. on April the 1st. And that's not an April Fool's joke. It will be 6 p.m. on April the 1st. So are there any other questions that anybody has? Thank you. Okay, well, thank you all very much for tuning in. And I hope to see y'all in person, or at least most of y'all in person next week. But take care and have a good rest of the week. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.